Chapter 95. Starlight Sunny felt that he was at the end of his rope. He had put himself through too much abuse during these last few days. Now, it was hard to even remember when was the last time he had slept. A day before climbing the soul-devouring tree in search of a special fruit, perhaps. Since then, he had lived through the harrowing torture of the blood-weave transformation, spent countless hours on the verge of mental collapse to resist the effects of the enthrallment, mangled his hands to stay lucid, guided the boat through the terrors of the dark sea in absolute darkness, saw it being destroyed by the horrid dweller of the deep, and gave battle to that monster in the cold, black depths, almost drowning as the result. His body and mind were on the brink of shutting off. Despite that, Sunny stubbornly continued to swim, bringing himself and Cassie closer and closer to the giant stone hand that was rising from the water, as though trying to embrace the skis. The dark sea was surging around him, still reeling from the effects of the light explosion that had rocked it some time earlier. Tall waves were threatening to drown the two sleepers, throwing them around like toys. Struggling against them was a hard task. And still he persisted. The dawn was drawing close, but for now there was still nothing but cold, darkness, and danger all around them. Any second, something could rise from the depths of the abyss and put an end to their desperate attempt to save themselves. At least the tentacles were gone, perhaps scared away by the pain of being exposed to the searing light. By some miracle, Sunny eventually managed to reach the stone hand. Hoisting Cassie up, he helped her climb on the dark rocks and followed closely behind. Soon, they reached the open palm of the hand and crawled to its center, then fell down, utterly spent and exhausted. For a long time, neither of them was able to talk. All Sunny could do was lay motionless, draw in raspy breaths, and try to stay awake. His mind was empty of thoughts. That was fine because he didn't want to think. If he did, he would be forced to remember what had happened to. Shut up. What was the point of remembering? He couldn't change anything. The sound of the black water crashing against the base of the giant hand reminded him that the night was still not over. Opening his eyes, Sunny tried to understand their current circumstances. Their shelter was slightly raised above the waves, the base of the giant thumb almost touching the surface of the dark sea. The palm was not very spacious, roughly half the size of the circular platform that had saved his life on his first day on the forgotten shore. It was angled upward, creating a slight slope. The fingers were higher above waves and wide enough to accommodate a person, but they were bent upward toward the sky, making them less suitable to serve as a refuge. We need to get further away from the water. With that thought, Sunny tiredly stood up and bent down to touch Cassie's shoulder. Cassie, stand up, we have to move higher. His voice sounded hollow and brittle. The blind girl flinched and raised her head, her skin deathly pale. Sunny. He nodded. Yeah, it's me. She was still in shock. Sunny could see that Cassie's mind was not all there yet, so he gently pulled her to her feet. Come on, let's go. It's just a few meters. She lingered. What happened? I heard a sound, and then something was pulling me down. He gritted his teeth and tried to keep his tone even. We were attacked by a sea monster. The boat was destroyed. I dove down and managed to find you, then swam to this pile of stones. It's not very high above the water, so. Cassie wavered. Where's? Sunny hurried to interrupt her, unwilling to answer the next question. Come follow me, we can rest when we're higher. Gently guiding the blind girl, Sunny climbed to the base of the giant hand's index finger, which was the highest point they could reach without climbing the fingers themselves. Sitting down on the cold stone, he rested his back against the giant phalanx and stared at the restless surface of the dark sea. His eyes were cold and empty. Cassie was silent by his side. Her pale face was contorted, as though she simultaneously wanted to ask the question and dreaded the answer. Finally, gathering her courage, the blind girl whispered, her trembling voice barely audible. "Sonny, where is Neff?" He stayed silent, not willing to speak the words out loud. Stupidly, he felt that if he spoke them, they would become the truth. But if he didn't, there was still a possibility that they were a lie. "I'm not answering." A few moments later, the familiar pressure appeared in his mind. The pressure grew and grew, making his head spin. "I'm not." Then the piercing pain came. Sonny stubbornly endured it. He lasted for much longer than he had ever done before, keeping his mouth shut until hot tears rolled from his eyes, his whole body shaking from the terrible suffering. But eventually, he was still forced to say those bitter words. She's J." Before he could finish, a subtle sound attracted his attention. It came from below, from the edges of the restless dark waves. Sonny's heart skipped a beat. Out there at the base of the giant thumb, where the cursed sea was almost touching its stone surface, a pale white hand appeared from the black water and grabbed onto the rocks. Then a tall figure slowly pulled itself onto the opened palm of the stone giantess. His eyes widened. Feeling that something was wrong, Cassie turned her head and asked, "Sonny, what is it?" He trembled and whispered, gripped with sorrow, "It's Nephis." An uncertain smile appeared on the blind girl's face. "Neph, she is all right." Sonny found himself unable to answer. No, Nephis was not all right. In fact, he didn't know how she was even alive. The Starlight Legion armor was shattered and torn, revealing the mutilated flesh beneath. There was a horrifying gaping wound on Changing Star's torso, looking as though almost half of her right side was missing. Sonny could see the sharp shards of broken ribs, the rivers of blood streaming down her legs, and the mangled mess of viscera spilling over the edges of the wound. He wanted to close his eyes. Another large chunk of flesh was missing from her thigh, exposing the shredded remnants of muscle and the white surface of the femur, cracked and barely holding together. Her right arm was severely damaged, too. In fact, it was almost torn off, hanging only by a narrow strip of skin and a few tendons, like that of a mistreated, broken marionette. Even her face was not spared. One of Neff's eyes was gone, its socket crushed and shattered. The skin of her cheek was shaved off as though by sandpaper, leaving behind a mangled mess of bleeding flesh and broken teeth. The sight of her was harrowing and heartbreaking. It was apparent that Changing Star was about to die. "Sonny, why are you not answering?" He glanced at Cassie and bit his lip, trying once again to suppress the answer that was fighting its way out. Something sharp and hot was stabbing at his heart, making his vision blurry. Meanwhile, Nephi staggered and blindly stepped forward. Her legs buckled, and she heavily fell to her knees, splattering blood all over the cold surface of the stone. A terrible moan escaped from her lips as her cracked femur finally shattered, bone piercing through muscle and skin. Sonny felt as though he was thrown into his worst nightmare. He wanted to scream, but his voice was gone. A deep, almost physical pain was tearing him from inside. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to see this. And yet he couldn't look away. That's why he noticed instantly when two white flames ignited in Neff's eyes. The radiance grew brighter and brighter, spilling from her eyes, her mouth, the gaping wounds in her body. It was as though there was a flaming star burning in the place where her heart should have been, as though she was nothing but white flame hidden behind a thin layer of human skin. The incandescent radiance filled Changing Star's blood, turning it into streams of liquid white fire. As Sonny watched, frozen in place with his eyes opened wide, that fire began to melt and reshape her flesh. Slowly, her muscles repaired herself, her organs returned to their places, her bones reassembled themselves from the shards. Where there was nothing to replace a missing part, the fire took its shape and solidified. With a terrible scream, Nephis grasped her almost severed arm and tore it away, then pressed it to the stump that was bleeding with white flame. Soon, the mangled halves melted together, becoming whole again. Shocked, he saw every terrible wound on her body heal, washed in the purifying fire. Soon, there was nothing but pristine white skin showing through the wide gaps in the shattered armor. Nephi's raised her head, looking at them but not seeing anything. There was no recognition in her gaze, all understanding destroyed by the cruel crucible of the sacred fire. Then the last daughter of the immortal flame clan closed her eyes and fell to the ground, losing consciousness. Finally, the first rays of sunshine appeared from beyond the eastern horizon. The dawn was coming. In the end, Nephis had remained unconscious for an entire 2 days. On the third day, she finally opened her eyes and slowly rose, looking around with subtle confusion. Her face, as usual, was calm and indifferent. However, she did flinch a little when her gaze fell on Sunny, who was sitting at the top of the giant hand's index finger and grinning from ear to ear at her. Frowning, Changing Star looked herself over, noticing the embarrassing gaps in her armor, and said, "Why are you smiling?" Sunny gave her a mischievous wink and shrugged. "Look behind you." Lingering for a few seconds, Neff sighed and turned around, wondering what is it that he wanted her to see. Behind her, a dark expanse of land was rising above the slope of the colossal crater. And on it, a tall city wall built of gray polished stone was towering over the giant chasm of the abyss. It looked ancient but still impenetrable, able to withstand the crushing pressure of the dark sea for 1,000 more years. They had made it. They had found the human castle. End of Volume 1, Child of Shadows. Wake up, Sunless, your nightmare is. Shut the hell up. Trying to remain in the blissful embrace of sleep, Sunny hissed through his teeth and stubbornly closed his eyes tighter. He was warm and comfortable under the blanket, on his own bed, where all the problems of the world seemed less serious and dire. For a moment there was silence. "That's better. Wake up, Sunless, you're." "Got it." Thrusting one arm from under the blanket, Sunny summoned one of his memories. Immediately, a triangular leaf-shaped throwing dagger appeared in his hand, only to be thrown blindly at the source of the irritating voice. Missing its mark, the kunai clinked against the stone wall and fell to the floor. However, the voice did fall silent. Sunny sighed. It was already too late. He was awake. Far in the distance, the waves were starting to crash against the city wall. The night was coming, so it was time to get up. Opening his eyes, Sunny sat up and looked around. His room was beautiful and spacious. The stone walls were engraved with intricate patterns, creating an atmosphere of sanctity and elegance. The furniture was made out of pale polished wood, with several mismatched pieces that Sunny had scavenged from different places himself. The room had no windows, however. There were light wells cunningly hidden here and there. Sadly, the ingenious system of mirrors that was supposed to bathe the hidden chamber in sunlight was long destroyed, leaving only darkness inside. Sunny didn't mind. In fact, this was one of the features of his secret lair that he enjoyed the most. Darkness was his best friend. Yawning, he stood up and rubbed his face to chase away the last remnants of sleep. His long, dirty hair was getting in the way, so he moved it back. "Let's make some breakfast. But first things first." Sunny moved his hand, pulling on the invisible string that connected his wrist to the ring-shaped pommel of the kunai. The throwing dagger jumped into the air and landed on his palm. This was a trick that had taken Sunny quite some time to master. In the beginning, he almost lost a couple of fingers while trying to learn how to control the flying blade. Walking over to a wall empty of engravings, he used the kunai to scratch a small line into the stone. All around it, there were dozens and dozens of similar lines, grouped neatly into sets of 5. It had already been 4 months since Sunny came to this loathsome, God-forsaken city. Many things had happened during that time. Cassie's vision turned out to be true. Far in the west, they indeed found a vast, ruined city surrounded by tall walls, with monsters wandering its narrow streets. And in the center of the city, there was a hill with a magnificent castle standing on its top. Miraculously, the castle was full of people. However, they weren't awakened, as the three of them had hoped. Instead, they were, each and every one of them, mere sleepers. Because they were no gateway in the castle. Hundreds of humans, those who had managed to survive the lethal hellscape of the Forgotten Shore due to their strength or luck, were stuck there with no hope of ever returning to the real world. It was nothing but a graveyard of hope. Remembering his first days in the castle, Sonny couldn't help but laugh out loud. Oh, what a fool he had been! So full of hope and newfound faith in humanity. Where's that faith now, huh? Laughing hysterically, he bent over and slapped his knees. Oh, that's funny. Good one, Sonny. What do you think about that, buddy? The shadow didn't respond, staring at him with reproach. Its silence only made Sonny laugh louder. He just couldn't stop. To be honest, he had gone a little bit insane some time ago, probably around his third week of living alone in the city. He was more or less all right after leaving the castle due to that unfortunate falling out with, well, it didn't matter. The point was that on his third week, that damn bastard of a knight had almost disemboweled him, leaving Sonny no choice but to crawl away while using his own two hands to stop his intestines from falling out. After finding his way to a secluded ditch and lying there for a few days, too weak to move and simply waiting to die, with not a soul around to help him, Sonny wasn't quite the same. Good times. Anyway, he survived. Dismissing the kunai, Sonny walked over to a table that he had scavenged from the ruins of a library and glanced at the gray rock that was lying in its center. No matter how you looked at it, it was just an ordinary rock. However, as soon as Sonny's gaze fell on it, the rock spoke. Wake up, Sunless, your nightmare is over. That rock was, in fact, one of his most valuable memories. In all ways except for one, it was indeed just a rock which was already useful enough. There were a lot of things that someone as devious as Sonny could accomplish with the help of a rock. However, this particular rock was also capable of parroting different sounds, which made it simply priceless. Right now, it was parroting Sonny's own voice. Wake up, you vile thing. Struggling with the irrational desire to turn the parrot rock into dust, Sonny dismissed it and removed a piece of cloth from the table. Beneath it, a few strips of monster meat lay on a silver platter. He had hunted this monster himself, which was not an easy task in these parts. In fact, as far as Sonny knew, he was one of the very few people capable of hunting in the city alone. The reason for this was that most of the nightmare creatures populating it were of the fallen rank, with only a handful of weaker ones hiding here and there. No one was crazy enough to hunt the fallen monsters. Instead, large hunting parties used experienced guides to avoid these powerful creatures while searching for easier prey. But to Sonny, singling out stray awakened monsters were comparatively easy. He hunted at night, using deep shadows to make himself nothing short of invisible. If he didn't want to fight a fallen abomination, he didn't have to. Most of the time. In any case, he never went hungry. Sonny grinned and said in a deeply satisfied tone, "Ah, life is good. Life indeed was good." In fact, Sonny would even go so far as to say that, currently, it was wonderful. One would expect that being stuck in a cursed city located in the middle of an actual hell, surrounded by nothing but ruins and horrifying monsters, was not really the best way to live your life. But to him, this was somewhat of a paradise. To his surprise, Sonny had found out that this type of existence suited him pretty well. He had no obligations, no need to worry about the future, and most importantly, was not required to interact with other humans. Humans always made things hard and complicated. He was sick of them. Being on your own was much better. He didn't have to pretend to be someone else, force himself to behave differently from how he wanted to, and strain his mind trying to understand people's convoluted feelings. For the first time in his life, Sonny could simply be himself. Turns out his true self was very easy to please. He had no shortage of interesting things to do, explore, and kill. His life was very entertaining and comfortable, all things considered. It was at least way better than his pathetic existence in the outskirts, back in the real world. The key to this harmonious feeling was very simple. It was to have no hope. Sonny discovered that hope was the true enemy of peace. It was the most vile and poisonous thing in the universe. If there was even a glimmer of hope to return home, he would have been desperate, full of anxiety, and probably in the middle of some insane disaster right now, like he had always been before. But without hope, things were simple and pleasant. He really couldn't wish for more. Keep telling yourself this crap. You might really believe it. Sonny grinned. What is there to believe? It's the truth. The shadow silently shook its head, long accustomed to his crazy tirades. Lately, Sonny had been talking with himself a lot, having long arguments that sometimes descended into screaming matches. It was a good way to pass the time. A bit later, he emerged from his secret chamber. Sonny's lair was situated in the upper part of a ruined cathedral, the entrance hidden behind a tall statue of some unknown goddess. There was a small balcony that allowed him to observe the grand hall of the temple over the goddess's shoulder, concealed from sight by the strands of her stone hair. The balcony was really high above the floor, making it impossible for any creature to climb on it by accident. Falling down would certainly kill a normal human. Sonny had discovered the hidden room while spying on the bastard that had gutted him. He had entered the cathedral through the hole in its roof and landed on one of the wide support beams, then walked across and accidentally noticed the small balcony. That's how he and the bastard had become neighbors. The bastard was, in fact, the guardian of this place. He patrolled the grand hall, killing anyone who dared to come inside. Sonny saw plenty of powerful nightmare creatures fall to his sword, cleaved apart without much effort. Of course, the bastard was a nightmare creature of considerable power himself. Sonny was pretty sure that he was at least a devil. Sharing the cathedral with a devil was very convenient. Sonny could sleep easy knowing that no monster would be able to reach the inner sanctum alive. Of course, he had to be careful to never be seen by his murderous roommate. On the upside, he could observe the devil as much as he wanted, waiting for a chance to exact his revenge. Sonny was hell-bent on killing the damn knight, eventually. The bastard had to die. But before that, Sonny had to become stronger, much, much stronger. Walking across the beams of the cathedral, he approached the hole in the roof and climbed through it. Outside, the night was already reigning over the world. It was time to hunt. A skeletal, hunched figure was slowly walking along the narrow street of the cursed city. The creature had long arms that ended with vicious claws and a deformed head with a wide mouth full of razor-sharp fangs. Even with its back bent, the monster was at least 2 meters tall. It was dressed in a torn shroud that was once white, but had long ago turned brown from the dried blood. This was Sonny's prey. The creature, which was called a blood fiend, was among the weakest dwellers of the cursed city. It was merely an awakened monster, barely intelligent and comparatively easy to kill. Of course, nothing was really easy to kill here. After all, each and every human on the Forgotten Shore was just a dormant beast. Despite the fact that they shared the same rank and class, blood fiends were less formidable than carapace centurions in terms of strength and speed. However, that was only until they smelled blood, which sent them into a murderous frenzy. In that state, these fiends were a true menace. Pathetic, Sonny thought, stalking the nightmare creature from the shadows. He had killed a few of these monsters in the past and had a great time each time. Well, except for this one encounter where he had accidentally scratched himself on a sharp stone. That was not fun at all. "Time to die, you ugly freak." The blood fiend was just about to turn the corner when a sudden sound attracted his attention. With unnatural speed, the monster turned around and fell on all fours, his sensitive ears picking up the slightest rustle. Then, he took a few careful steps forward and stopped at a certain spot. In front of the fiend, an ordinary-looking rock was lying on the ground. A second later, the rock suddenly spoke. "Behind you," it said politely. The creature froze for a moment, then turned around with lightning-fast speed. Something whistled in the air, and the upper part of the blood fiend's body separated from the lower. Still refusing to die, the monster reached out with its long arms. Too slow. Sonny slashed with the midnight shard, severing one of the arms at the elbow. Continuing the motion, he took a quick step forward and performed another strike, this time piercing the creature's skull. The tip of the takai entered through one of its eyes and exited through the back of the head. All of it took less than a second. By the time both parts of the monster fell to the ground, Sonny had already retrieved his sword. Looking up with expectation, he smiled and waited. "Come on, say it." As if answering his call, the spell whispered. "You have slain an awakened monster, blood fiend. Your shadow grows stronger." Sonny grinned. "Ah, thank you kindly, you're so sweet." The runes shimmered as they appeared in the air in front of him. Looking down, he read, "Shadow fragments, 398/1000. Just 2 fragments away from 400. These days, he was progressing at a very respectable speed. In the beginning, back when he had not known the city and the creatures that populated it, Sonny was lucky to get a few fragments in a week. He had also been much more prone to ending up bloodied and one step away from death. But now, things were slowly changing. He couldn't even remember the last time he felt compelled to say goodbye to life. "Ah, you idiot. You just had to go and think that out loud, huh?" Just as he finished that thought, a distant sound of footsteps reached his ears. Sonny looked grimly at the corpse of the blood fiend, then in the direction of the approaching footsteps. Who was crazy enough to remain in this cursed city during the night? Only a complete lunatic would do something that stupid. All the sane people were long gone from the streets, not to mention that very few were willing to enter the ruins to begin with. A dark shadow flowed from the tip of the midnight shard's blade. Coalescing on the ground, it stared at him with sarcasm. Sonny stared back. "What?" The shadow shook its head and didn't answer, forcing him to turn away with a confused shrug. "Whatever, it seems we have guests. What to do, the place is a mess." Looking around, Sonny sighed, glanced at the corpse of the monster once again and summoned the kunai. The smart thing to do was to run away. Who knew what exactly was producing those footsteps? Maybe it was a group of people, maybe it was a nightmare creature with a lot of feet. It was better not to find out. But he wasn't done with the hunt yet. He still had to get his trophies. "Go take a look." Sending the shadow away, Sonny kneeled and began to cut the tough flesh of the dead creature. Without the enhancing effect of the shadow, slicing the blood fiend apart was not as easy. However, he still managed to find the first soul shard rather quickly. One more to go. Meanwhile, the shadow had discovered the uninvited visitors. 6 humans were cautiously walking along the narrow path in the stone ruins, lighting their way with a ghostly blue lantern. They were all rugged men, wearing mismatched suits of armor and armed to the teeth. Their eyes were cold and hard. Sonny raised his eyebrows. My, oh my, they really are people. What is a bunch of Gunlog's thugs doing outside the castle walls in the middle of the night? Gunlog was the owner of the castle and the self-proclaimed king of this odious place. Every sleeper on the Forgotten Shore was forced to either serve him or pay him tribute. Even still, the latter usually didn't live long. Dismissing the Midnight Shard and the Parrot Rock, Sunny concentrated on searching for the second soul shard. He wanted to be gone from the street before these gentlemen arrived. But the circle of blue light was approaching too fast. Finally catching a glimpse of the glowing crystal, Sunny grabbed it and hurriedly hid it in his armor. Then he dropped the kunai on the ground and took several steps back. But it was too late. They had already seen him. "Be careful, there's a monster." As Sunny was backing away, several weapons were aimed in his direction. Feeling that things were about to get out of control, he cleared his throat and said in a trembling voice, "Oh, please don't hurt me, I'm a human." Saying this, he mentally looked himself over. With his ghostly pale skin and dirty hair, his ragged armor covered in layers of dried and fresh blood, Sunny was indeed easy to mistake for a nightmare creature. He wasn't really paying much attention to personal hygiene and appearances these days. Hopefully, speaking in a human language would prove his identity. Raising his hands to show that he wasn't armed, Sunny took another step back. The 6 sleepers were really surprised to see another human this far away from the walls of the castle, especially at night. Using their momentary confusion, he cautiously moved even further away. "Don't move." Finally able to comprehend the situation, one of the castle inhabitants hissed a threatening command. Sunny obediently froze, careful not to make any sudden movements. The unexpected guests proceeded to come closer, glancing at the corpse of the blood fiend as they walked past it. One of them was taller and better equipped than the rest. Piercing Sunny with a menacing gaze, he approached him and stopped 1 or 2 steps away. The man was older than Sunny by a few years. He was tall and muscular, with a patchy beard covering the lower part of his face and a mean look in his watery blue eyes. From his demeanor and memories, it was easy to tell that the leader of the group had spent no less than 3 years on the Forgotten Shore. He had experience and time to grow stronger than most sleepers here. However, it was also apparent that he wasn't really high up in the ranks of Gunlog's army. Otherwise, his equipment would have been much more impressive. Still, the heavy battle axe that was resting on the man's shoulder looked really sharp. It would take him only a second to bring that thing down on Sunny's head. "Who are you? What the hell are you doing here?" Sunny blinked a couple of times, then gulped and answered carefully. "Oh, I'm Sunless. I live here." The leader of the hunting party, if it was one, narrowed his eyes. "What, live here? Do you take me a fool, boy? No one can survive in the city." The other sleepers were of the same opinion, except for one, who looked at Sunny with doubt. Frowning, he took a step forward and said in an uncertain tone, "Wait, Chief, he might be telling truth. I heard that there's a crazy kid who lives in the ruins alone." The taller man scowled. "How is that possible?" His subordinate glanced at Sunny and shrugged. "From what I heard, his aspect allows the boy to hide in the shadows really well. I guess he crawls around like a rat and picks up the leftovers after the monsters are done eating. I don't really know, but someone was talking about him back in the castle. I thought they were just telling tales." Sunny frowned. Crazy boy rat, why did everyone feel compelled to call him names? Meanwhile, the helpful sleeper thought for a bit and added, "I think he came into town with that bitch, Changing Star." Sunny's frown turned into a scowl. Looking down, he whispered to his shadow, "These guys are really very rude, don't you think?" Of course, his whisper was easily heard by everyone around. The sleepers stared at him in confusion. Sunny tilted his head a little and opened his eyes wide, as if shocked by something. "What, you think I should kill them all? I mean, isn't it a little bit over the top? I should give them a chance to apologize at least." The leader of the hunting party took a step forward and said in a low, growling voice, "What are you mumbling about, rat?" Sunny looked at him with scorn and dissatisfaction. "Hey, I was talking to my buddy. Can you please not interrupt?" A wide, dangerous smile appeared on the tall man's face. With a sigh, Sonny turned to him and said, "All right if you insist. You guys have offended my dearest friend, Nephi's of the Immortal Flame Clan. She and I are very, very close, so I'll give you one chance to apologize for calling her a well, you know. If you don't, say goodbye to your lives." The older man stared at him for several seconds, then suddenly raised his head and laughed. "Oh, that's a good one. Have you heard, guys? This tiny weasel will give us a chance. How generous. Should we be generous too, huh? What do you say? The boy is sick in the head, after all." The other 5 sleepers were not sharing his enthusiasm. One of them smiled darkly and said, "No, Chief. I think we should just kill him. Put the poor fool out of his misery, you know." The sleeper that had corroborated Sonny's story before, meanwhile, was frowning again. "Wait, guys, he's one of Changing Star's people, remember. The original group, I mean. They had survived 2 entire months in the labyrinth on their own. We shouldn't underestimate." However, the leader interrupted him with a contemptuous scoff. "I heard that Saint Nephi's carried 2 useless sacks of shit on her back all the way to the castle. The bitch is fond of taking care of weaklings, right? That delicious little friend of hers is blind, for God's sake. I'm sure that this one is no better." Then he turned to Sonny and grinned. "I tell you what, Rat, give us all your memories and we'll be generous enough to let you live." If an awakened died, their memories disappeared with them. The only way to get the memories was to make the owner transfer them of their own free will. However, whether or not that will was affected by coercion or torture didn't really matter, at least not to people like these. Sonny blinked. "So you're not going to apologize?" The tall man grinned. "I think not." Sonny sighed. "Oh well, so you want my memories, eh? I have a few. Let me think, how about this one?" Lowering one hand, he summoned the parrot rock. It immediately appeared on his palm, looking as boring and ordinary as always. The leader of the hunting party frowned, not taking his eyes away from Sonny's face. Despite his crude exterior, he was paranoid and careful. Years of experience had taught him to never lower his guard. A moment later, the rock spoke. "Behind you." That was the most basic of tricks. The tall man grinned, still looking Sonny in the eyes. "Do you really think that I would fall for?" However, before he was done talking, the blade of the kunai hit him from behind, penetrating the back of the man's skull and killing him on the spot. Sonny had dropped the throwing dagger near the monster's body in advance and then took all those steps back to make this exact situation possible. As soon as the parrot rock spoke, he pulled on the invisible string, sending the kunai flying back in his direction. The tall bastard didn't just happen to be in its path, either. "You have slain." The leader of the hunting party really should have listened to that rock. Shadow grows stronger. Before the sleepers even had time to react, Sonny was already moving. The shadow had been wrapped around his body a long time ago, making him that much faster. Summoning the midnight shard, he fluidly slashed at the nearest enemy, severing the man's arm at the elbow. The blade struck right between the vambrace and the counter of his enchanted plate armor. To Sonny, these people were slow and clumsy, their power level and technique severely lacking. He had already been more experienced than them after the harrowing journey through the Crimson Labyrinth, learning how to wield the sword in combat from Changing Star herself. The 3 months he had spent hunting and surviving alone in the Cursed City only made the gap that much wider. Despite looking like easy prey, Sonny was anything but. However, he wasn't foolish enough to challenge all 5 of them. People might have been weaker than nightmare creatures, but what made them really dangerous was their unpredictability. Each aspect was unique, arming humans with a formidable arsenal of inexplicable abilities. Facing something you couldn't understand was the surest way to end up dead. With his advantage of surprise gone, Sonny decided that it was time to retreat. Turning around, he jumped out of the circle of light and ran. It was really hard to pursue someone who could see in the dark on these narrow streets, so there was a real chance of escaping unscathed. However, the kunai was still attached to Sonny's wrist. Sliding out of the dead leader's skull, it fell to the ground and clinked loudly against the stones, then jumped a few meters away and hit the pavement again, creating more noise. Get the bastard, he killed the chief. Following the sound of metal striking against stone, the sleepers lunged forward, following in Sonny's footsteps. What a persistent bunch. Even the guy who had lost his arm was on his heels, either having a way to stop the bleeding or simply unwilling to let the attacker escape, even if it cost him his own life. This part of the city was Sonny's hunting ground. He knew every nook and cranny of these streets like his own 5 fingers. Honestly, he was unsure what these guys were even thinking. If it wasn't for him carefully choosing the path, they would have ended up disturbing some terrifying fallen creature and becoming its dinner a long time ago. Something wasn't quite right here. Gunlog's people might have been thugs, but they were experienced and accomplished hunters. They feared the city and knew how to behave while outside the castle walls. Otherwise, all of them would have been dead a long time ago. Come to think of that, it was extremely rare to see them going anywhere near the city at night. Were these fools even real hunters? If not, what were they up to? Sonny briefly considered leaving one of them alive to interrogate later, but then decided against it. To be honest, he wasn't really curious. Human business had long ago lost its allure in his eyes. He had much more interesting things to do. Finally reaching his goal, Sonny lingered on the steps, pretending to be in a panic. The 5 sleepers were once again able to lay eyes on their victim. The scrawny kid was hesitating in front of the entrance to a large ruined building, fear clearly written on his dirty, pale face. It seemed as though he didn't know where to go, afraid to run into a dead end. Noticing them, he flinched and dove into the building with desperation in his eyes. "You have nowhere to run now, rat," hissed the man who had lost his hand to Sonny's blade. Full of killing intent, the sleepers followed the crazy young man into the building. However, once they got inside, they saw no sign of the scared kid. The only thing they saw was a simple rock lying on the floor. As the one-armed man belatedly realized that something was wrong, the rock said in an ominous tone, "Say goodbye to your lives." A second later, a massive silhouette stepped out of the darkness. The man's eyes widened as the figure of a regal knight clad in a menacing black armor reflected in them. The creature was more than 2 meters tall, his Gothic armor forged from a lusterless, anthracite steel. Every part of the armor was decorated with intricate engravings that told a tale so horrifying that anyone would go insane from looking at them for too long. The helmet of the Black Knight was crowned with curved horns that might have been wings once. In the narrow fissure of his visor, 2 ghastly red flames were burning with indescribable menace. Before the sleeper had time to react, a heavy black blade fell from above, effortlessly severing his body from head to groin, cutting through flesh, bone, and armor with similar ease. A torrent of blood surged to the floor. Climbing onto one of the supporting beams of the ruined cathedral, Sonny sat down and looked at the slaughter that was happening below. The bastard is in a really bad mood today. Well, have fun." Some time later, as the echoes of screams began to fade away, he sighed and counted the corpses lying on the distant floor. It was hard to count because most of them were in pieces. Making sure that not one of the pursuers got away alive, Sonny frowned and shook his head. 6 people, their disappearance won't go unnoticed, especially if they were really up to no good. Why do I feel like I have just gotten myself in trouble? The Black Knight remained motionless for several minutes, silently observing the corpses of his enemies. Drops of blood fell from the blade of his fearsome greatsword, gathering into a puddle beneath his feet. The thoughts of the cruel creature were a mystery. To be honest, Sonny wasn't even sure that this unstoppable mountain of murderous black steel was sentient. In that regard, the monstrous inhabitants of the cursed city were a bit strange. Usually, nightmare creatures of higher classes possessed a perverse form of intelligence, which was often comparable to that of humans, and sometimes even surpassed it. However, that rule did not apply to every monster in this eerie place. From Sonny's observations, the dwellers of the ruined city could be roughly divided into two groups. The first group consisted of various creatures that came here from outside the wall, be it from the labyrinth or from the depths of the dark sea. These abominable things, more or less, followed the unnatural laws of the spell that every awakened was familiar with. The second group was different. These creatures, he suspected, were either created from the remains of the ancient residents of the city or, creepily, had actually been them once. The wraiths, as he called them, were much more unfathomable and dangerous. Their powers and behavior refused to abide by any sort of sense or logic. The Black Knight was one of these sinister revenants. That's why Sonny had trouble predicting his actions. Most of the time, the regal devil was content simply patrolling the grand hall of the ruined cathedral and killing anything that dared to come inside. Just like he had killed those poor fools. With a sigh, Sonny lay down on top of the support beam, and not paying any attention to the deadly height of his improvised resting spot, closed his eyes. He wanted to take a breath before continuing with his nightly errands. Soon, the sound of heavy footsteps informed him that the bastard had resumed his never-ending patrol. Good riddance. Despite the fact that nothing was disturbing his peace anymore, Sonny still felt strangely restless. His inner voice was in the mood to chat. Sonny, aren't you forgetting something?" He frowned. What was there to forget? He was just catching his breath before going out again. He also had to wait for the right moment to scavenge through the possessions of these dead hunters. "You just killed 6 people. Don't you feel guilty?" Sonny was a little startled by this question. Curious, he listened to his emotions and came to the conclusion that no, he did not feel guilty at all. This was his 3rd time killing a human being. Granted, the first time happened inside a nightmare, where people were supposed to be simple illusions. However, Sonny wasn't sure that he believed in this theory. The old slaver's anguish had felt awfully real to be just a figment of his imagination. The second time, well, he didn't want to think about that. That happened in the castle anyway, and that part of his life was over. The 3rd time was the cleanest of them all. Those thugs were going to rob and kill him anyway. Sonny had seen through their intentions long before pulling on the invisible string and sending their leader into the cold embrace of death. He could have tried to run away, but they were very rude. If the thugs had insulted just him, Sonny might have tried to end the confrontation without bloodshed. However, they insulted Nephi's. Bastards deserved to die. Despite the fact that his relationship with Changing Star had become strained, he still cared about her a great deal. Leaving the castle did not mean that he had forgotten their friendship. It's just that there were more reasons to leave than to stay. With a sigh, Sonny summoned the beautiful bottle made out of patterned blue glass. This was the farewell gift that Cassie had given him before their parting. He cherished this memory very much. Bringing the bottle to his lips, Sonny took several sips of cold, delicious water and opened his eyes. He didn't want to rest anymore. Better to get moving. Before venturing out again, Sonny returned to his room and walked over to a large iron chest that was standing in one of its corners. Exerting some strength, he lifted the heavy lid and admired his treasure pile. Inside the chest, more than 100 beautiful soul shards were glowing softly in the dark. The sight of them always lifted Sonny's mood. Despite the fact that he himself had no use for the soul shards, they were still a valuable resource. Here on the Forgotten Shore, shards were a form of currency among the sleepers. 100 of them was an unimaginable amount. After a lifetime of being a pauper, Sonny was finally rich. Money, I have so much money. If a person wanted to live inside the castle walls, they had to pay a tribute of 1 soul shard every week. Those who could not afford it were forced to remain outside, living in a makeshift settlement just beyond the gates, which was often attacked by the monsters. Even so, they had to pay for food or go out and hunt themselves, which more often than not led to their deaths. With how much Sonny had gathered in these 3 months, he would have been able to live in the comfort of the castle for years if he wanted to, which, of course, he did not. Why would he pay for accommodations when he already had a palace of his own? One with no noisy neighbors and a fearsome guardian protecting the premises, no less. Putting 2 new soul shards in the chest, Sonny glanced at his dragon hoard one last time and closed the lid with a satisfied smile. Perhaps it was time to visit the castle again and buy a few things. No. He had already bought everything he needed the last time. Spending too many shards would make people doubt that he was as pathetic as everyone thought he was. Of all the sleepers in the castle, only 3 people knew that he was not just good at hiding in the shadows and avoiding danger. They were Nephi's, Cassie, and Castor. That damn bastard. Castor had been lucky enough to enter the dream realm near the city and arrive at the castle much earlier than the 3 of them. By the time Sonny, Nephi's, and Cassie had found their way to the human settlement, he was already in good standing there. Despite the fact that there were a lot of opportunities for a talented legacy to rise through the ranks of Gunlog's army, he had nevertheless decided to remain independent and eventually join the Changing Stars cohort, drastically raising their combat strength and reputation. Looking back, that was when all of Sonny's problems had really started. That's right, it was all his fault, not mine. Yeah, definitely. Grinding his teeth, Sonny kicked the heavy chest and cursed under his breath. Then, acting as if nothing had happened, he smiled brightly and left the hidden chamber once again. Down below, things were getting interesting. Attracted by the smell of blood, several monsters tried to enter the ruined cathedral to feast on the fresh corpses. However, the Black Knight was as full of wrath as ever. Just as Sonny climbed onto the support beams, he was finishing off a large creature that looked like a praying mantis made of human skin. Initially, Sonny planned to take a look at the material possessions left behind by the 5 unfortunate thugs, but the sight of the ferocious battle made him change his mind. He would have to do it later. Besides, his shadow had already looked through the bloody remains and came to the conclusion that there was nothing really valuable among the dismembered corpses. Not wasting any more time, Sonny escaped through the roof of the cathedral and retraced his steps to the place where he had fought the Blood Fiend. The body of the hunting party's leader was still there. Of course, his memories had long disappeared, leaving the bearded man dressed only in rags. The heavy battle axe was gone, too. Sonny sighed. That's why killing people is not worth it. His shadow covered its face with a hand and shook its head dejectedly, trying to express that his wording was nothing short of unfortunate. Sonny frowned. What, it's not? And for him it was doubly so. When one awakened killed another, they received a considerable portion of the enemy's soul essence without having to shatter their soul shard. Sonny, however, was not an ordinary awakened. His aspect was based on consuming shadow fragments instead. That meant that even if his enemy had absorbed hundreds of soul shards in the past, Sonny would only receive the number of shadow fragments matching their rank and class, just like he would after slaying a nightmare creature. Since all sleepers were mere dormant beasts, in this case, the number was 1. Just 1 fragment away from 400, Sonny said, a bit disheartened. All that work for nothing. Some small, rational piece of his mind was actually relieved that killing humans was not very lucrative. Otherwise, in his state, no, he wouldn't. Surely. Wouldn't what? Sonny blinked a couple of times, waiting for his inner voice to answer. However, it was strangely silent. Shrugging, he bent down and searched the dead man's body, hoping to find something of value. However, he was left disappointed. There was no pouch full of soul shards as he had imagined. All Sonny found was a strange piece of fabric that had been secretively tucked away into the tall thug's shirt. Looking at the fabric, he noticed crude shapes drawn on it with ink. Some shapes looked strangely familiar. Is that a map? Indeed, it was a primitive map. The shapes he recognized were the various landmarks located in the neighboring parts of the cursed city. Sonny knew many of them by heart and had even explored a few in the past. A treasure map. Suddenly, the strange timing of the hunting party's arrival and their lack of experience made perfect sense. They weren't actually hunters. Instead, they were a bunch of fools who had been swindled by some smart person back at the castle into buying a fake treasure map. At least that was the most likely possibility. However, but what if it's real? Sonny blinked, looking at the map with a mix of distaste and avarice. He couldn't decide whether he should try and follow it or throw it away. Luckily, his thought process was interrupted by a thunderous crash. One of the buildings not far from where he was standing suddenly collapsed, filling the street with a cloud of dust and flying debris. A massive shape flew through the air and heavily crashed against another wall, causing an avalanche of stones to fall down. The creature tried to stand up, but then twitched and grew still, spilling rivers of fetid blood all over the pavement. It was unmistakably dead. Sonny quickly hid the map in his armor and dove into the shadows, trying to understand what was happening. Somewhere near, furious roars and the sound of steel clashing against steel could be heard, growing closer with each second. Strangely, there were no human voices. A battle between nightmare creatures. Such things were not rare in the cursed city, but to Sonny's knowledge, there were very few things capable of challenging the current masters of this street and the adjacent square. These creatures were not the most powerful among the inhabitants of the city, but due to their unique characteristics, Sonny tried to avoid them like the plague. He saw several monsters much more powerful than anything he would be willing to take on, ending up sliced and diced into tiny pieces on that square. However, none of them was able to give the protectors of the square as much trouble as they were having right now, at least judging by the desperate sounds of the battle. Intrigued, Sonny decided to take a look. Hidden in the shadows, he climbed up the tall wall of an ancient building and soon arrived on its roof. Watching his footing, Sonny walked forward until he reached the opposite edge of the building. From there, he could see the wide square in all its dark glory. In the middle of the square, a moving statue was fighting against several hulking monsters. On a dark square surrounded by ruins of once magnificent buildings, a vicious battle was coming to an end. The remains of its solemn protectors were lying on the cold cobblestones, ruthlessly shattered into pieces. Sonny blinked in shock. They actually lost. He was really astonished. The living statues that used to guard the square were a very tough bunch. As far as nightmare creatures of the cursed city went, they weren't the most formidable in terms of size and physical might. However, their strange bodies were extremely durable and capable of withstanding truly devastating amounts of damage. Aside from that, the stalwart stone warriors were also disciplined, proficient in the use of weapons and utterly deadly. They were able to perfectly coordinate their movements, using strategy and tactics to silently overwhelm opponents whose power far surpassed their own. Countless monsters fell to their blades. That's why Sonny had always avoided getting into a confrontation with these weird creatures. Even though they weren't fallen by rank, the stone revenants represented a threat that was enough to make him wary. However, now the ownership of the square was about to change hands. The bodies of the previous masters lay shattered to pieces. In death, they looked just like broken statues. Even their metal armor and weapons had turned to stone after the wielders were destroyed. There were 5 or 6 of these stone piles scattered around the square, while the attackers seemed to have lost only 3 of their numbers, including the massive monster that had been sent crashing through a building earlier. Each body towered above the dark cobblestones like a small hill. The invaders were of a type of the nightmare creature that Sunny had never seen before. These new menacing monsters looked like giant spiders with bodies covered in thick plates of wrought iron. They moved with terrifying speed and force, sending cracks running through the cobblestones with each step. There were currently 2 of them left on the square, circling around the lone surviving stone warrior. The last of the living statues seemed to be a female. Compared to the spiders, she was almost comically small in stature, standing no taller than Sunny himself. The graceful stone creature was armed with a sword and a round shield, wearing a plate armor that covered most of her body, leaving only the eyes exposed. Or rather, 2 rubies burning with crimson flames that these creatures had instead of eyes. Her armor and weapons were black in color, forged from some unknown and incredibly heavy stone-like alloy. Of course, in reality, they were made out of the same stone as their wielder. However, the dark force that had turned the granite body of this nightmare creature into the strange approximation of flesh had also turned the stone armor into metal. Currently, the last of the living statues was standing with her shield raised, the blade of the sword resting on its rim. Her head was lowered, ruby eyes silently following the movements of the 2 spider monsters. Sunny didn't know for sure, but he suspected that these spiders were both fallen beasts. In any case, the stone woman was doomed. Her enemies were just toying with her, savoring the helplessness of their victim before finishing the job. He didn't really care. In fact, he was waiting for the show. Watching nightmare creatures slaughter each other was one of his favorite pastimes, and the best thing about it was that it didn't matter who won. "Come on, get her." However, in the next moment, he was surprised. In a strange turn of events, the stone monster lunged at the spiders first. Calmly striking her sword against the rim of the shield twice, she dashed forward with grim determination. The spider she was aiming at was a second too late to react. However, due to its superior physical form, it was still able to meet the sudden onslaught with a vicious strike of its own. One of its legs shot forward, threatening to shatter the stone body of the attacking living statue into tiny pieces. The smaller creature deflected the blow with her sword and bashed the spider with the round shield, putting all of her weight and inhuman strength into the strike. Sunny blinked as the massive body of the fallen beast was thrown back and toppled over. The black sword immediately lashed out, sending a shockwave through the spider's guts. A rain of strikes fell on the iron surface of the monster's abdomen, filling the square with the clangor of metal. The stone warrior attacked with savage ferocity, using both the sword and the shield to inflict as much damage as possible in a short amount of time. Just as the iron plate protecting the soft innards of the monster cracked, the second beast joined the fray. The following bloodbath was nothing short of horrifying. Despite the fact that the spiders were much faster and stronger, the steadfast stone wraith kept up with them for a while. Her indomitable will and ruthless resolve were enough to give the fearsome creatures pause. Moving with the deadly precision of a bloodthirsty killing machine, the living statue completely disregarded self-preservation in favor of making her enemies suffer. It seemed as though she was determined to take them to the grave with her. Soon, the terrible wounds on her body accumulated, making the stone creature look like a vandalized piece of macabre art. However, the spiders were no better. Their fetid blood was spilling everywhere, painting the whole square red. Severed limbs and shards of cracked iron littered the ground, mixing with the shattered remains of the fallen stone warriors. Finally, one of the spiders fell heavily to the ground and twitched, drawing its last breath. The remaining beast lunged at the staggered stone monster, its countless eyes burning with fury. The round black shield rose one last time and then flew aside, torn away along with the right arm of the stalwart living statue. However, almost at the same time, The blade of her sword pierced through the massive beast's skull, ending its life just a moment before breaking apart and turning to stone. Sonny shook his head. What an impressive sight! A lowly awakened creature slaying two fallen beasts. Midnight Shard would have liked that fierce last stand a lot. Come to think of it, this was nothing short of inconceivable. However, the graceful stone warrior paid dearly for performing the bloody miracle. Staggering once again, she fell heavily to the ground, clearly done for. The battle for the ownership of the Dark Square was over. Nobody won. As the dust settled, Sonny abandoned his hiding spot on the roof of one of the buildings surrounding the square and jumped down. Avoiding the puddles of fetid blood, he walked among the corpses littering the ground and approached the dying stone monster. The nightmare creature was lying on her back, her body battered and broken. From up close, Sonny was able to see it better. The black armor of the strange monster was slowly turning to stone. In its gaps, he could see her slightly lighter skin. It was smooth like polished granite and dark gray in color. Streams of ruby dust was flowing from the terrible wounds, looking almost like blood. Two crimson gems that served her as eyes slowly moved, focusing on Sonny. There was no particular expression in them, just tired stillness. The flames that used to burn inside were slowly dimming. The statuesque creature stared at him without making a sound. In fact, Sonny wasn't sure that these monsters were even capable of producing sounds. Throughout the whole fight, she had remained eerily silent. He sighed. Life is not fair, huh? With these words, he summoned the Midnight Shard and thrust it through the visor of the dying creature's helm. Even at the death's door, the stone-like flesh of the living statue proved to be extremely tough. However, he put enough strength into his strike, not wishing to make the poor thing suffer more than necessary. He was always glad to kill a nightmare creature, but this one deserved a quick death. To be honest, he was very impressed by the small stone warrior's desperate last stand. They didn't know who they were messing with, but you showed them. At that moment, the familiar voice of the spell resounded in the darkness. You have slain an awakened monster, Stone Saint. Your shadow grows stronger. Sonny smiled. That's 4 shadow fragments, finally, 403. However, in the next second, he forgot what he was thinking about, because the spell wasn't done talking. Whispering into his ear, it slowly said, You have received an echo, Stone Saint. Sonny's eyes opened wide. Did he hear it right? An echo. He had finally received another echo. Cautiously looking around, Sonny lowered his voice and said to the shadow, You heard it too, right? The shadow stared at Sonny in exasperation, then gestured at its mouth, lowered its hands and didn't say anything. He smiled. Exactly, that's what the spell said. Humming a song, he paced back and forth for some time, then suddenly flinched. Oh, right, I should get out of here. Now that the stone people are gone, who knows what kind of horrors will try to make this square their nest. He made a move to leave, but then stopped and looked at the scene of slaughter with avarice. However, I really should get some mementos first. It's not every day that you stumble upon that many dead nightmare creatures before the carrion eaters arrive to feast on the corpses. This was a chance he won't get any time soon. Sonny hesitated for a few seconds, trying to decide which monsters to approach first. The spiders were obviously much stronger. If they were really of the fallen rank, their soul shards would be incredibly valuable. However, buying anything with a bunch of ascended soul shards would be very suspicious. Plus, it would take a while to find the crystals inside the massive bodies of the giant beasts. The living statues were of the lower rank, but their shattered remains were easy to search. The other inhabitants of the cursed city could arrive at any minute. So, with a deep sigh, Sonny ran to the nearest pile of shattered stones and kneeled beside it, hoping to notice the gleam of the soul shards as soon as possible. He was barely done with the second dead statue when a sudden noise made him stop. Knowing that greed had doomed a lot of people to their deaths, Sonny suppressed the desire to linger here to the last possible moment and quickly dashed away, putting the last crystal he had managed to find inside his armor on the run. Summoning the kunai, he threw it into the air and then pulled on the invisible string, making the dagger spin around a stone column. As soon as the string coiled itself around the column, he jumped and made the string contract, sending him flying up. Just like the golden rope, the invisible string that connected the kunai to his wrist was incredibly sturdy and capable of changing its length at will, which allowed Sonny to use the throwing dagger as an improvised grappling hook from time to time. Using the top of the stone column to jump even higher, he grabbed onto the cracks in the wall of one of the ruined buildings and quickly climbed up. By the time he reached the roof, the noises produced by the approaching creature were already loud enough to make him shiver. Whatever that thing was, Sonny didn't want to find out. The sound it produced, while moving, made him think of a giant snake, one with countless mouths, each hissing the notes of a strange, maddening tune. Luckily, he left the wide square just in time to never meet that abomination. By the time Sonny had returned to the ruined cathedral, the night was already coming to the end. The eastern horizon was growing lighter, and the sound of the black waves crushing against the city wall was growing restless. Walking across the support beams stretching above the grand hall, he caught the glimpse of the marching Black Knight inside. One day, he was going to kill the bastard on some glorious day. But not this day. Today, he had other things to do. Reaching the safety of his hidden lair, Sonny put the soul shards into his treasure chest and then sat down on a magnificent wooden chair. There was an excited smile on his face. It was finally time to find out what was the difference between a normal echo and one transformed into a shadow. Not wasting any more time, Sonny dove into his soul sea. Despite his changed mental state, it was as calm as always. The silent expanse of still water stretched into the empty distance, with the shadow core hovering above like a dark star. Tiny spheres of light floated in the air around it, reflecting on the surface of the tranquil sea. The silent shadows were still there, standing motionless at the edge of darkness. Compared to before, their ranks had swelled. Monsters of all shapes and sizes were among them now, making Sonny's collection of slain enemies look increasingly impressive. Walking past them, he glanced at one or another from time to time, recalling the thrilling battles with a mix of dread and pride. This was his personal museum, a dark monument to all his sins. Wait, sins, why sins? Just at that moment, Sonny stumbled and stopped. Not too far away from him, a gaunt shadow stood among the menagerie of terrifying creatures, silently staring at him with empty eyes. That shadow once belonged to a young man, not much older than Sonny himself. He had lived in the ramshackle settlement beyond the castle's gates, struggling to survive like everybody else. Before. Sonny looked away. Don't you look at me like that. It was your own fault, fool. You shouldn't have asked me all those questions. Out of the 3 people he had murdered with his own hands, this kill was the only one that made Sonny feel something, because it wasn't done in the heat of the battle or to settle a personal score. This one was done in cold blood. It was why he had to leave the castle, among other things. Sonny grimaced. I said stop looking at me. Just stay dead and don't bother me with your nonsense. Huffing angrily, he turned away. Soon, he walked past the shadows of the Blood Fiend, the hunting party's leader, and the deadly stone saint. Glancing at the statuesque figure of the stone monster, Sonny forgot all about the gaunt shadow and smiled. He was here to take a look at her echo, after all. The prospect of having another echo under his command was already very exciting. The loyal and strangely personable scavenger had been of great help to Sonny in the past, tremendously increasing his combat performance. After all, Despite having a divine aspect and a uniquely powerful ability, Sunny was still just a dreamer, one whole rank below the Echo. The Scavenger, however, was merely a beast, while the Stone Saint was a monster. Her power was comparable to that of the ferocious Carapace Centurions, far surpassing anything that Sunny could ever hope to achieve in this cursed place. The strange nature of the steadfast living statue made her even more formidable. Having a servant like that would make many impossible things possible. However, Sunny wanted even more. He was waiting to see what miracle his aspect was going to perform, hoping that the results would surpass his wildest expectations. Soon, he was standing under the black sun of his shadow core, observing the spheres of light that represented his memories. There were 9 of them now. The ones that he actually used were the Puppeteer's Shroud, the Midnight Shard, the Prowling Thorn, the Ordinary Rock, and the Endless Spring. Savoring the anticipation, Sunny summoned each of them one by one and read the glowing runes surrounding the memories. He had gotten the heavy kunai after defeating a peculiar creature that resembled a monstrous armored porcupine. The rain of jagged bone quills had left several holes in Sunny's body, but the reward was well worth it. Memory Prowling Thorn. Memory Rank Awakened. Memory Tier II. Memory Type Weapon. Memory Description. This flying dagger is as unpredictable and fickle as the affection of a young beauty, but perhaps not as deadly. Memory Enchantments. Rose of Betrayal. Enchantment Description. The Prowling Thorn is connected to its wielder by an invisible string. This string is strong but mercurial, just like the treacherous bond of sentimental attachment. After reading this description for the first time, Sunny couldn't help but wonder if the spell had been scorned by a lover once. The runes practically exuded bitterness. Next on the list was his most dangerous memory, the Talking Rock. Memory Ordinary Rock. Memory Rank Awakened. Memory Tier I. Memory Type Tool. Memory Description. Just an ordinary rock. Memory Enchantments. Not really. Enchantment Description. The word is mightier than the sword. The rock is mightier than the word. The funny thing was that the ordinary rock, which was capable of repeating various sounds, had fallen into the hands of a person who was unable to tell lies. It was now the most honest memory in 2 whole worlds. It had also made Sunny think twice before opening his mouth, sometimes. The last memory he decided to take a look at was, perhaps, the most precious to him. It was the beautiful glass bottle that Cassie had given Sunny as a farewell gift. Memory Endless Spring. Memory Rank Dormant. Memory Tier IV. Memory Type Tool. Memory Description. A lovesick devil had once imprisoned a mighty river in this fragile glass bottle. It was his gifted to a beautiful desert spirit. Memory Enchantments. Gift of Water. Enchantment Description. This bottle contains enough water to make flowers bloom in the desolate heart of the most lifeless of deserts. This one was sort of romantic. It seemed as though the spell was all over the place when coming up with these descriptions, to the point where Sunny couldn't even tell if it was being serious. With a sigh, he dismissed the sphere of light containing the endless spring and glanced up. The other 4 of his memories were not very useful. They were an incredibly heavy tower shield, a suit of armor that was worse than the Puppeteer's Shroud in every regard, a glass eye capable of producing bright beams of harmless red light, and the obnoxiously loud silver bell, the first memory he had ever gotten. The remaining 3 had been awarded to him for killing comparatively weak monsters on the streets of the cursed city. He was hoping to trade them for something more suitable during his next visit to the castle, whenever that might be. Forgetting about the memories, Sunny finally focused his attention on the brightest sphere of light that was floating in the dark emptiness above his head. The one containing his new echo. He willed it to descend and watched as the sphere glided down, softly touching the surface of dark water a few moments later. It slowly dimmed, revealing the stone figure hidden within. Here in the dark silence of the Soul Sea, the stone saint looked just like a statue. She was approximately as tall as Sunny, looking miniature in comparison to the rest of the nightmare creatures he had to face on the forgotten shore. She was also uniquely human-like in appearance. If not for the dark gray hue and the stone-like nature of her granite skin, Sunny might have even mistaken the strange monster for a sleeper, provided he couldn't see much of her body behind the graceful dark armor. The nature of these strange creatures remained a mystery. Previously, Sunny had considered the living statues to be just that, monuments brought to life by evil spirits. There were a lot of revenants like that walking the streets of the cursed city. Take the Black Knight, for example. Sunny was almost sure that the bastard was actually just a suit of armor with a vengeful wraith imprisoned within it. He had no proof that there was an actual body in that moving steel fortress, at least. However, after watching the stone saint die right before his eyes, he wasn't so sure that she and the Black Knight were the same anymore. There certainly were similarities. Even the design of their armors was somewhat similar, as though one had originated from the other. But the stone warrior's armor seemed much more ancient. And then there was the ruby dust that flowed from the stone creature's wounds instead of blood. Since when did statues have blood? It was almost like these strange creatures were designed to possess their own weird form of life. Come think about it. The stone warriors resembled artificial beings brought to life by some dark magic, much more than they resembled undead creatures. Mysteries, mysteries, mysteries all around. Perhaps the runes describing the stone saint would provide him with some answers. The echo, meanwhile, was coming to life. Two magenta flames ignited in her gemstone eyes. The stone of her armor suddenly gleamed with subtle metal shine. The smooth surface of her granite skin turned slightly less rigid. Silently turning her head, the saint gazed at Sunny through the narrow split of her helmet's visor. Let's see. He concentrated on the runes. Echo Stone Saint. Echo Rank Awakened. Echo Class Monster. Echo Attributes Battle Master Stalwart Mark of Divinity. Sunny blinked. Mark of Divinity. That was the same as his original attribute. What business did a nightmare creature have walking around with the traces of divinity left in its evil, corrupted soul? And what with these other attributes? Battle Master Attribute Description. Born on the battlefield, the Stone Saint is proficient in all forms of combat. Stalwart Attribute Description. The Stone Saint is highly resistant to all forms of damage, as well as being fully immune to mind and soul attacks. Bewildered, Sunny shook his head. No wonder these silent stone warriors were so deadly. They were literally a bunch of killing machines created to last as long and deal as much damage as possible on the battlefield. But who had created them? Leaving the attributes alone, he lowered his gaze and read the next line of runes. Echo Description. Deep in the cavernous halls of his dark domain, the last child of the had created them from stone to quell the fire burning in his resentful heart. However, that fire only grew hotter. Designed to bring peace, they were instead born into an endless war. The unknown again, or rather their children. It seemed like his theory was correct. The Stone Saint was either an artificial being or a descendant of one. In any case, that was before she was corrupted by, well, whatever it was that had corrupted all the nightmare creatures, and especially those in the cursed city. Now even gods wouldn't be able to describe what exactly she was. Not that it mattered, a monster was a monster. Sunny was more interested in the fact that the traces of divinity that the stone warrior bore had to have come from their original creator, who was at least partially one of the unknown, which meant that the unknown indeed were closely related to the gods and to divinity itself. just like mysterious Weaver. Looking away from the runes, Sonny studied the motionless echo with his altered eyes. What he saw made him smile darkly. Just like the memories, the true essence of the echo was weaved from the countless diamond strings that formed an infinitely complex pattern. Only in its case, the pattern was even more elaborate, dwarfing anything that Sonny had previously seen. Two embers were burning inside the stone saint's body, serving as anchors for the endless strings. One of them was situated in the place where her heart should have been, the other in the lower part of her abdomen. Sonny closed one eye and looked more closely. And there, behind the shining pattern of the diamond strings, he noticed another, much more primitive and crude system of adamantine threads. They pierced the stone flesh of the echo, resembling a human nervous system. These strings were also seemingly made from diamond, but they were much less ethereal. In fact, they were entirely corporeal. Sonny frowned. Makes sense, that makes sense. Wait, how does it make sense? The memories and the echoes were created by the spell. They were artificial. The stone saint, too, was artificial, but in a much more mundane sense. She was made by a child of the unknown, just like her echo was made by the spell. Which meant what? That the technique that had been used to create the stone saint was eerily similar to the technique that the spell used, although it did look extremely primitive in comparison. Could that mean that the spell itself had come from the unknown? Sonny grimaced and shook his head. No, no. Although it was a sound theory, there was too little information to actually consider it substantiated or even remotely believable. He needed to find out more, learn more, uncover more before even beginning to understand the true story that connected the spell, the gods, the unknown, and his own life into one nightmarish tapestry. But there would be time for it later. Right now, he had something equally as interesting right within his grasp. Glancing one last time at the graceful stone monster, Sonny gulped and licked his lips. Then he said timidly, Let's do this." Taking a step forward, he hesitated, and then carefully put his hand on the breastplate of the stone saint's armor, right across from the place where the main nexus of her spell weave was situated. To his surprise, the breastplate felt like stone and was warm to the touch. It was as though a furious crimson flame was burning inside the nightmare creature's chest. Huh. As soon as Sonny touched the echo, a new string of runes appeared in the air in front of him. Transform echo into a shadow. He hesitated, once again afraid to make the choice. What was he going to do if the process made the stone saint weaker or even useless? Trying not to think of this possibility, Sonny sighed and forced himself to say, "Yes." An imperceptible change happened to the soul sea, as though a gust of wind suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The tranquil dark water seemed to simultaneously stay still and move restlessly. Then, a sudden pressure came from somewhere above. Raising his head, Sonny saw two dark beams descending from the depths of the shadow core. One of them fell on the echo, while the other landed on one of the silent shadows that stood motionlessly behind his back, as though connecting them together. Bathed in the dark light, the shadow of the dead stone saint slowly dissolved into it. And then the echo began to change under Sonny's watchful eyes. The echo began to change. The light falling from the shadow core seemed to seep into the flesh of the stone creature, making it shine with dark radiance. Wisps of shadowy fog emanated from beneath her impervious plate armor, slowly merging with it. It looked as though the stone saint was engulfed in ghostly black flame, being remade by it. What little color there was on her body was washed away and replaced with nothing but darkness. Only two crimson fires burning in her ruby eyes remained, slightly changing their hue and becoming more menacing. Of course, all these changes were happening on the surface. If not for the traumatic transformation that Sonny had gone through to inherit a part of Weaver's forbidden lineage, this would have been all he saw. However, with his eyes altered by the agony of consuming the drop of divine blood, he was able to see much more. Beneath the surface, the essence of the echo was being changed as well, in a way much more fundamental than its outer appearance. The shining embers that served as anchors for the weave of diamond strings had lost their radiance, becoming as transparent and empty as the shadow core itself. The diamond strings were gone, replaced by a sea of darkness. That darkness had a form, a shape that perfectly followed the lines of the stone saint's body. It was as though a living shadow was now inhabiting it, usurping the role that had been played by the pattern of the sorceress strings once. Although similar in appearance to the original echo, this new creature was a completely different type of existence. Sunny had never seen anything like it before. It was created by his aspect, after all. The process of transformation, meanwhile, was coming to the end. The ray of dark light cast by the shadow core was disappearing, its reflection drowning in the calm water of the silent sea. The black flames were already fully absorbed by the stone-like armor of the saint, gone with the dark radiance of her smooth granite skin. Sunny observed the stone saint, clad in the lusterless black armor, with two ruby flames burning in the deep shadows of the visor. She looked like an incarnation of pure darkness, a noble demon sent to wage war against heaven from the depths of hell. What changed the most, however, was her presence. Before, the echo felt like an empty shell, a magical tool rather than an actual being. Now, however, there were hints of mysterious will in her crimson eyes. A subtle sense there was a nascent spark of sentience burning somewhere deep within her lightless soul. Or whatever it was that the menacing monster had instead of a soul. This was a shadow. Just as this thought appeared in Sunny's mind, the faintly familiar voice of the spell resounded above the dark waters of the Soul Sea. "You have created a shadow monster, Stone Saint." Hearing these words, Sunny smiled. However, a second later the smile disappeared from his lips, replaced by a pained expression. Only now, after the process was complete, he felt a subtle emptiness permeating his whole body. He felt weakened. The loss of 100 shadow fragments was finally making its effect known. He had suspected that spending them in this way would reverse the process of power accumulation that had consumed him for these last few months, but it was still an unpleasant feeling. He was much stronger than he had been during the journey through the labyrinth. However, some of his physical might was unmistakably gone, leaving him with a bitter feeling of regret. No, he had known that this would happen, and decided to proceed with the experiment anyway. It was well worth it. Forgetting about the change in his physical state, Sunny walked around his shadow and observed her from different sides. The stone saint's eyes silently followed his movements, sending glints of crimson light reflecting from the black surface of the tranquil sea. "This is amazing. I wonder what she is capable of." Summoning the runes, Sunny immediately noticed that there was a new cluster shining right beneath the one describing his echoes. Shadow's Stone Saint. Excited to learn more about his new pet monster, Sunny was about to concentrate his attention on the runes, but then stopped and glanced down at his own shadow, a little embarrassed. Sorry, how are you feeling, buddy? You aren't, jealous or anything." The shadow looked away and pretended that it didn't know him. It was seemingly indifferent to the appearance of a new shadow creature in his service, even though this new shadow had a capital letter to its name. "Well, I just wanted to say that you shouldn't be. I still value you very much. Even though the Stone Saint is probably capable of slicing powerful monsters into tiny pieces with her sword, while you're still just a useless piece of an incredibly capable scout and my most trusted confidant, I still appreciate you. Yeah." He stared at the shadow for a bit, and seeing that it didn't react in any way, turned away. This guy, he'd better step up his game, huh? Focusing on the runes, Sunny summoned the description of the shadow and read, "Shadow Stone Saint. Shadow rank awakened. Shadow class monster. Shadow attributes Battle Master, Stalwart, Spark of Divinity. Sunny blinked. It seemed as though Stone Saint's divine attribute had evolved to match his own. Was it because he was her master? This was a nice surprise. However, he still didn't see how she was different from before. Frowning, he continued to look through the shimmering runes. Shadow description. Shadow Saint was created by the treacherous lost from light in the cursed darkness of the Forgotten Shore. Again with this whole treachery stuff. Can I get another epithet, huh? But in the next moment, he forgot all about this little frustration, because the following line of runes showed him something really unexpected. Just beneath the description, a familiar set of runes shined in the air. Shadow fragments, 0/200. Sunny stared at the runes, perplexed. Then a sudden light of understanding appeared in his eyes. He finally realized what was the principal difference between an echo and a shadow. It was really very simple. The echoes were mere replicas of the creatures that had left them behind. They were molded in their image and never changed, always remaining the same as the originals at the moment of their deaths. Shadows, however, were different. After all, they were mercurial by nature, always changing their forms and shapes depending on the environment. And so, a shadow was capable of change to some extent too. It was capable of growth. His eyes widened. By slaying nightmare creatures, he was able to absorb their shadow fragments and become stronger. Eventually, his shadow core was bound to evolve, turning from dormant to awakened and beyond. The jump in power that came with this evolution was nothing short of unmatched. Granted, he wasn't sure about the particular details of this process, not to mention that, as a human, he could only become an awakened after returning from the dream realm into the real world, which was impossible to do in this God-forsaken place. He also didn't know what would happen if he actually managed to accumulate the 1,000 shadow fragments that the runes demanded. But no matter what happened, if he were to continue walking forward on the path of the awakened, he would eventually outgrow his memories and echoes, rendering them weak and useless against the enemies of the comparable rank. He would then be forced to discard them and try to find suitable replacements, with no guarantee whatsoever that he would actually succeed. This problem was not as dire when it came to memories, which were comparatively easy to get. The echoes, however, were exceedingly rare. Once an echo grew too weak to accompany its master, replacing it was an extremely tall task. But shadows were capable of growing with him, becoming more powerful just as he grew more powerful. As long as Sunny was willing to put in the work, his shadow would never fall behind. The possibilities that this simple quality opened up were truly endless. It was enough to completely change his plans for the future. In the past, Sunny always envisioned himself as the main force on the battlefield, only relying on memories and a stray echo or two to support him. That was because echoes of higher ranks and classes were so unimaginably hard to come by. Although much more rare than memories, there were still many dormant echoes around, and a fair number of awakened ones too. They were mainly shared among masters and saints, who were capable of defeating the nightmare creature of these ranks with comparative ease. But battles against fallen and corrupted monsters, not to mention anything even more dreadful, were never easy. As such, there were not enough trophies brought back after killing creatures of their kind to make the idea of acquiring an echo of a higher rank a realistic possibility. For everyone except for Sunny, he could slaughter weaker monsters, get lesser echoes, and then cultivate them into unstoppable beasts of slaughter. Not bound by the laws of probability and diminishing chances, he could slowly build an army of powerful shadows to fight his battles for him, and then watch them destroy his enemies from a safe distance while sipping on a cocktail. That's what rich people drank, right? Not to mention that monsters were not bound by the need to pass nightmares to raise their rank, at least not to Sunny's knowledge. To be honest, he had no idea how nightmare creatures evolved their cores. Carapace Demon had seemed to do just fine just by eating the fruits of the soul tree and slowly absorbing large amounts of soul essence. In any case, there was a possibility that he would be able to make the Shadow Saint much more powerful than he himself had the chance to become on the Forgotten Shore. Perhaps even powerful enough to make his life here truly tolerable. Looking at the Shadow with excited sparks dancing in his eyes, Sonny grinned from ear to ear. "You and I are going to accomplish great things together, buddy." If his own shadow wasn't worried about its place in his heart yet, it would be smart to start worrying about it right about now. The question that was consuming Sonny's thoughts now was this: how, exactly, was he supposed to feed the Shadow Saint with fragments? If he could simply transfer some of his own to her, he would do it without a second thought, even though that would diminish his personal strength even further. However, there seemed to be no way to do so. No amount of looking at the runes, touching the silent stone creature, or trying to talk to the spell did the trick. Sonny even asked for advice from his own shadow, but that guy was in no mood to talk. The scornful word traitor was written all other his expressionless dark spot of a face. At least that's what Sonny read from it after being met with the silent treatment. In all the excitement, he failed to remember that the shadow was physically unable to speak. Scratching the back of his head, Sonny paced around the soul sea and tried to come up with a reasonable way to stuff some shadow fragments inside the taciturn stone monster. Well, the most obvious answer is to go and make her kill some nightmare creatures. However, will it work? When my loyal scavenger killed something, it was I who received the fragments, not him. Wait, him. Did Cassie infect me with her childish desire to assign human qualities to everything? It not him. It was I and not it. Right, that's better. Wait, what was I talking about? Glancing at the outside world, Sonny frowned. It was currently the day there. Usually, he would be sound asleep by now. Going out during the day was dangerous. He would have to walk outside the shadows, allowing all kinds of fallen horrors to lay eyes on him. He only survived for so long in this hell by being extremely cautious, cowardly, and only hunting during the night. He paid a harsh price to learn these lessons, almost losing his life in the process. But still, should he risk it? Still undecided, Sonny dismissed the Stone Saint. He was curious to see if the slumbering shadow would become a sphere of light just like an echo would. However, she did not. As soon as he gave the command, the ornate armor of the stone creature was immediately engulfed in black flame, and with a gust of ghostly wind, she was gone. It seemed as though the shadow was returned into the embrace of the shadow core that had created her, and was now sleeping in its depths, bathed in the invisible waves of nurturing dark flames. Sonny scratched the back of his head. So, the shadows literally dwelled within the deepest part of his soul. He didn't really know how to feel about this, but felt that it was strangely fitting. He was a child of shadows himself, after all. With a thoughtful sigh, Sonny emerged from the soul sea and looked around his secret lair. Outside the ruined cathedral, the sun was shining above the cursed city, but none of its rays could reach this tranquil hidden chamber. Sonny suspected that once, long ago, the secret room served as the private quarters of a venerated young priestess who performed sacred rites in this temple. He had found some of her things in the modest wardrobe that was hidden behind a stone panel, somehow preserved in pristine condition, despite the thousands of years that had passed since the city had fallen to the curse of darkness. If not for the lamentable disparity of their genders, he would have had a whole collection of clothes to wear, instead of spending every waking hour dressed in the same good old puppeteer's shroud. There were limits to the amount of abuse that even a fifth-tier armor could withstand. However, in a sense, he was lucky. At least his armor was made out of soft fabric. It would have been much worse if he had to wear a suit of plate armor or a rusty chainmail instead. That priestess, of course, had not used the same extravagant method to enter her private quarters. There actually was a doorway that led outside the room and into a concealed corridor that ended with a narrow stairwell. However, the stairs had long collapsed, leaving only a deep vertical shaft behind. This was Sonny's route of escape in case someone or something would find his lair. Standing up from the magnificent wooden chair, Sonny paced around for a bit and then lit the fire under a makeshift stove, planning to make himself some late supper. The orange flames illuminated the hidden chamber, sending shadows dancing on its walls. Oh right, I never got fresh meat. The night was so eventful that he had completely forgotten the initial purpose of his hunt. Throwing the last few strips of meat on the grill, he seasoned them with salt and sighed once again. The desire to simply venture outside and get into a fight with the nearest nightmare creature seemed more attractive with each minute. No, 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 that's how you end up dead. To distract himself from these seductive thoughts, Sonny decided to summon the stone saint into the material world and perform a few experiments in the safety of his secret lair. Standing up, he willed the shadow to appear. The secretive chamber was submerged in deep shadows. His own was hidden in one of them, standing with its arms crossed on the cold stone wall. In Sonny's vision, it appeared as a silhouette made from a deeper shade of black. Usually, an echo would appear in front of the summoner, weaved from the countless sparks of moving light. However, the stone saint entrance was completely different. Instead of materializing out of thin air, she stepped out of his shadow like a sinister dark night. Wreathed in darkness, her elegant figure emanated a sense of danger and foreboding. First, two ruby eyes ignited in the depths of the shadow. Then, the darkness came to life and surged forward, taking the form of the deadly stone monster. The sole of her stone-like soleret touched the floor with a loud clang, and a moment later, the shadow saint was standing in the middle of his room, her hand resting on the pommel of her sword. Sonny grimaced, feeling a slight headache. So, the shadow was hiding in a shadow, and then the shadow came out of the shadow to stand with it in the shadows. This is starting to get out of hand. I really need to come up with better terminology. He felt that this was a vital problem, but no suitable words came to his mind. Glancing at the silent duo, Sonny hesitantly asked, "Any ideas?" Sadly, both his shadow and his shadow were mute and unable to voice their opinions even if they wanted to. Left with no assistance whatsoever, Sonny sighed. "All right, I'll think of something later. For now, let's see what you're capable of." Summoning his shadow, he wrapped himself in its comforting embrace and faced the stone saint, preparing to test her strength. Inhaling deeply, he focused and gave the menacing monster a command. "Strike me." Sonny expected that the shadow would hesitate for a moment, maybe even requiring some persuasion to turn on her master. Instead, the stone saint immediately leaned forward and punched him in the chest without a second thought. With his physical prowess enhanced by the shadow, Sonny was sure of his ability to withstand one blow from the awakened monster, at least to a certain degree. However, he was wrong. So wrong. Before he could even react, the armor-clad stone fist crashed into his ribs, making Sonny feel as though he was hit by a train. In the next second, he found himself lying on the floor, surrounded by numerous pieces of broken wood. Oh no, my chair. The magnificent chair was gone, ruthlessly turned into splinters and firewood by the impact with his back. It was completely unsalvageable. Sonny's back wasn't doing much better. Turning onto his stomach with a moan, Sonny spat a bit of blood on the stone floor and weakly raised one hand, giving the shadow saint thumbs up. Good, well done. 10 out of 10, just like crap that really hurts, just like I expected." Casting a furtive glance at the elegant stone knight, he forced a smile out and tried to stand up. "I think I need to amend some details of the future experiments." Next, Sonny was planning to enhance the stone saint with the shadow before getting her to strike him again. However, on second thought, There were better ways to measure her power. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be SUPRISC for all of you. Stay tuned.